So welcome, everyone. I work in humanitarian emergencies, and behind me on my sort of home office wall, you see a kind of schema of some of the issues that and some of the ways they connect in humanitarian emergencies. And I just want to draw your attention in the first instance to the little corner here in the right-hand corner, where talks about some of the ways that things connect together in terms of humanitarian response, that we try to save lives, we try to reduce harm, that is including things like sexual and gender-based violence, SGBV. We try to work to strengthen diverse communities because diverse communities are stronger against some of the battering of the public health emergencies and the climate emergencies and the conflict that might beset them. We try to work to build peace, and sometimes that is through very small, small sort of humanitarian pauses for humanitarian aid to get through. We try to build a foundation for the future in very, very tumultuous situations. And then at the bottom of that, let me see if I can turn on the light here. At the bottom of that, I hope you see the last little line there. It says, hope, all is not lost. And I show you that in the first instance because my colleague saw that behind me on a Zoom call, and she said, what does that say behind you? And I said, hope, all is not lost. And she said, after a pause, she said, I like the full stop. And I would have to agree with her. The full stop is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Hope, all is not lost. I would like to share a story about a hope project. Maybe there will be some helpful ideas along the way. I have a purpose in telling you this story and encourage you to develop your own hope project. As Alex has said, I'll talk for about 40 minutes and then we'll have a very short break and have some time to reflect, hopefully very spacious silence and reflection and sharing together. And then Alex, can I just check with you? We're gonna end at 9 p.m. your time, is that right? Okay, great. Climate breakdown, the COVID pandemic, current conflicts, sometimes all at once. Let's just pause here and acknowledge something. If you find hope easy, you're not paying attention. We consume bad news in many formats all of the time. There are even new vocabulary words to describe the social media activity that many of us engage in. Doom scrolling, doom loops. I'm fairly resilient usually, but my story of hope begins in a doom loop. I share it in case it is helpful to other people. Around August of this year, in trying to absorb the images we were watching from the Kabul airport in Afghanistan, I found myself being pulled into an undertow of low feelings, a fear that merged into dread for where we are all heading. That lasted a few days. But something occurred to me. I thought to myself suddenly, God does not want you to be living in constant anxiety and dread. I feel sure that that is not the life any of us are called to, but gloom spreads easily. Hope needs work. So My Hope Project 2021. How to find hope while still reading the news. For this project, I would use tools from professional disciplines like humanitarian research and practice, and history, and scripture, tradition, and theology. Working with these tools, I decided I would do my day job while asking myself a few questions. First, what do you see? Second, what are you learning? Third, what needs to be done? My friends in Corrymeela will know that these questions have a provenance. The first and the third are from David Stevens and Ray Davey, former community leaders. The second is from former center director Michael Earle. After 4 months in My Hope Project, I have enough material for a book, but I will try to narrow down to a few reflections to share under these 3 headings. What do I see? What am I learning? What needs to be done? Hope. All is not lost. What do I see? When we were new to Corrymeela as a family in the early 2000s, David Stevens used to seek us out and ask, "What are you seeing?" He was genuinely curious. He was at the center of the Corrymeela community, but he wanted that new perspective from the edges. And so here is what I see. The New York Times online front page today has a feature called Postcards from a World on Fire, which include images of climate change impacts on every country in the world. My work emails have sentences like the following: the impacts of global warming are already killing people and devastating lives and livelihoods every year, and they will only get worse without immediate and determined action. I'm reminded of in the mid-2000s Christian Aid's campaign that was called Climate Changed with a D at the end of it. And that was already, unfortunately, 15 years ago. And I quote again, "The frequency and intensity of climatological events are increasing substantially, with more category 4 and 5 storms, more heat waves breaking temperature records, and more heavy rains, among many other extremes." In the last 24 hours, I understand the Midwest of the US has experienced its most deadly tornadoes ever in history and recorded in history. The email that I've received and just quoted goes on to talk about actions that are needed to mitigate this unfolding catastrophe and to adapt. On the COVID side, there are 82 countries who haven't achieved the WHO target for this year of 40% vaccination. Sub-Saharan African countries, not only does that lead to increased misery for many in those countries, it also means that the chances of other variants developing remains open. Red Cross research in another document continues, in quotes, "The world is on course for a wildly unequal recovery. Social and economic recovery is strongly tied to the efficacy and equity of vaccination programs. That comes to the equitable distribution of COVID-19 vaccines, and richer countries continue to monopolize doses," end of quotes. The COVID-19 pandemic carries in its wake wide mental health impacts, even in countries where vaccines are plentiful. As the BBC reported recently, we might think of this as the first, in quotes, mass trauma, end of quotes, event since World War II in terms of collective impact. The pandemic has brought massive bereavement, untold impacts on doctors and nurses who see it and have treated so many people at risk to themselves. The impacts of severe COVID on those who have survived it. And for almost everyone, life and rhythms disrupted, distorted time, scattered brains. We yearn to do what we usually do in times of grief and upheaval, reach out, join together. And that has been difficult at best. I know that you see what I know that I see what you also see. As the advice columnist in The Guardian recently put it so succinctly, so much of our polity drenches us in pain. I notice that these hard facts also lead to hard feelings, sadness, grief, anger, cynicism, fear, even dread, or maybe just tiredness, being burned out, physically, emotionally, spiritually exhausted, feeling isolated, feeling powerless. And all of these might be all tangled up. We may all have felt a sense that there is no hope, that we can do nothing to improve a difficult or worrying situation. A definition, in fact, of despair, one definition of despair. So I want to pause and say that these feelings may interact in complex ways with mental ill health issues that may need more support, more expertise, more treatment. So I'd like to encourage anyone listening to this to seek help from a professional if you think that you may need it. But there is also a wider context here that can involve all of us. We know from humanitarian emergencies that mental ill health along a spectrum of severity is a very real aspect of the fallout that we are all dealing with. Everyday mental resilience can be a challenge for all of us in these times. The BBC reports that COVID-19 is in fact a textbook case of mass trauma. I understand that trauma, and I know some people on this call will know far more about it than I do, but my understanding is that trauma is about a rupture in our usual way of making meaning in our lives, the way we see ourselves, the way we see our world, the way we see other people, all can be shocked and overturned by an event or events. We can become unmoored by trauma, the need to reframe, and we need to reframe with a new way of making meaning. What do I see? I'm afraid I have to start with trauma and the challenges for our mental health. And yes, perhaps in some cases, despair. I think we would all agree that we need a better response to all of this than just telling each other to buck up. But let's also start with hope and what it might be. I've been challenged in humanitarian response to think about positive mental health as a crucial part of our well-being. So I want to start here by acknowledging its role. I ran across in a bookshop a beautiful anthology of stories and experiences of people who have experienced different kinds of mental ill health. I'll hold it up for you all to see the references. It's called The Book of Hope, 101 Voices on Overcoming Adversity. And it's edited by mental health campaigners Johnny Benjamin and Britt Pfluger. From this anthology, here's a definition from Jada Caesar, describing her own journey with mental ill health and hope. She says, and I quote, "To me, hope is a gentle bridge between what is and what could be. Hope, all is not lost. Hope is a bridge." A gentle bridge is one image for hope. In The Guardian, the advice columnist Eleanor Gordon Smith was asked how to find joy in the midst of so much suffering in the world. She used the image in her answer of a spark of how to find joy in the midst of so much suffering. She told a story about trying to start a fire in the rain. And she talked about how she remembered all 3 layers of her clothing were drenched through and sodden wet, and the rain was pouring down in torrents. I know both New Zealanders and Northern Irish colleagues and friends will know that feeling. And she said that in that drenched and sodden and torrential rain, she said, fire seemed unimaginable to me because it was too far from what I was experiencing. There was a contradictory gap between being so drenched and fire that I couldn't get across. But a spark, she said, I could imagine that. You can get a match to fizz when it's pouring, she said. And it turns out that a fire doesn't care at all whether you could imagine it in advance. It only cares whether you can give it a spark. You don't need to focus directly on joy, she told the person asking the question. If you try to imagine little sparks of happiness instead of full-blown fire of joy, you won't run into the same clash of contradictions. Those sparks can show up flinty and bright inside all kinds of torrential misery. Next to every disaster, there are people who are trying to help. Under every oppression, there are people being brave. Asking whether they'll win is a good way to despair. Noticing that they're there is some kind of spark. Try to catch a little spark, she said. Hope, all is not lost. Hope is a bridge. Hope is a spark. Second question, what am I learning? The second question comes from Michael Earle, who was center director at Corrymeela, but I didn't actually know him until I moved to New Zealand, where he now lives too. A few years ago, when we were having one of our first conversations after meeting, he told me that he always asks himself, what am I learning? And it strikes me that that is one of the best questions ever, because it's such a genius question, because it works regardless of what the circumstances are. We've talked a little bit about trauma, Here, I think it's relevant to share an emerging concept from humanitarian emergency response, something called psychological first aid, or PFA. Like physical first aid, it's not a substitute for advanced care, but it's like the psychological equivalent of CPR for traumatized people, perhaps. In a situation of trauma, the aim of PFA is to help people do some basic things in their first responses. The aims are to reduce the initial distress, to meet current needs, to promote flexible coping, and to encourage adjustment. It's most often used in the first hours, days, or weeks following an event. And perhaps I might say here, picture this being used all over the world in circumstances most of us can only imagine in humanitarian emergencies in many languages. Is used across the humanitarian over 190 countries. These psychological first aid approaches, though, they're kind of first response approaches, but they also come up sometimes as helpful during public inquiries, looking back on events or for anniversaries. So what do psychological first aiders do? Well, what they try to do gently within the circumstances where they find themselves as first responders, or as responders in perhaps places where people have gathered after a traumatic event or have come for assistance or support, is that they try to establish, firstly, a sense of safety. They try to establish a sense of calm. Thirdly, they try to help establish connections. Next, they try to help people regain a sense of their own agency, however small a start, their own agency. And that might be what's called self or group efficacy, agency. And finally, they try to create an environment appropriate, gently, sensitively, in which the traumatized person might find a sense of hope, a sense of safety, a sense of calm, a sense of connection, a sense of agency, and a sense of hope. Psychological first aid. By definition, this is an approach for people who are experiencing dislocation. It is, as I say, used around the world now after tsunamis, floods, earthquakes, and fires in temporary settlements in long-term camps. Sensitive and patient interaction to try to establish safety, calm, agency, connection, and hope. So the practice of humanitarian response at its best now addresses psychological first aid. Down the line, then often humanitarian responders will work with lingering and profound trauma too. There seems to be so much wisdom here. I think starting with the interconnectedness of health and mental good health and hope. We know from humanitarian response that there is no health without mental health, and that every response has to address, and that the best responses have to address that. I found the psychological first aid training to be hugely helpful, not least because it can provide a basic checklist for how to look after ourselves in a traumatic situation. For my Hope project, I considered what I might do in my daily routines to try to establish a sense of safety, a sense of calm, a sense of connectedness, a sense of agency, and a sense of hope. I found myself searching out mindfulness exercises, and just yesterday I found a new one, which is kind of cool, which is to outline your hand and breathe in while your finger moves up your thumb, and then out while it moves down your thumb, and then go around your two hands that way. Pause to breathe, to feel your body and find your feet, as one mindfulness book said. Pause and breathe. More than that, I found it really helpful to think about some of the spiritual traditions and disciplines that have wisdom from thousands of years. A wonderful set of people who are teaching me to stand still and learn more about yoga. And I really appreciate that, and to breathe around prayer and journaling, around setting out what I'm grateful for, around setting out intentions for the day. A sense of safety, a sense of calm, a sense of connection, a sense of agency, and a sense of hope. Hope can be an anchor when we become unmoored by traumatic events. Hope is an anchor. So what else am I learning? I thought perhaps I should find out how the biblical witness treats hope. It seems that in Hebrew, hope, tikva, is a rope, possibly in the sense of a lifeline. I'm from the United States, as Alex said, and I have a Mayflower ancestor called John Howland. Well, me and maybe, I don't know, maybe even millions of others. John Howland is basically the boy who lived from the Mayflower. In his teens, during the crossing from Old England to New England, he fell overboard during a tumultuous storm. And quite incredibly, from 20 feet under the ocean with the waves crashing over his head, he managed to grab the lifeline that was thrown to him and hang on until he was dragged back into the boat. And he went on then to have a family of 12 children with his wife, Alice Tilley, hence all the multitude of descendants. But the reason that I mention him is that I always imagine him being 20 feet under in a raging gale, and somehow seeing the rope, and somehow reaching the rope, and somehow grabbing the rope, and somehow holding on. Hope in the Psalms is that lifeline. When you read the Psalms with all of their imagery of near drowning, for example, Psalm 69, save me from sinking in the mud, don't let the flood come over me. You feel that sense of hope as a lifeline. You have to be really scared, really facing life and death issues beyond your control to understand the terror of the psalmist. Psalm 34, put your hope in God. Psalm 39, my hope is in you. Psalm 71, Psalm 71, my hope and my trust, thou art my tikva, my rope, my lifeline. Psalm 71 again, hope continually. No wonder these are the words that people reach for in the hospital and at a funeral. When the power of evil is too much for me, hope as a lifeline reminds me I can't do this myself. When surrounded by the power of death and feeling overwhelmed, we reach for hope in prayers and hymns as well as scripture. If you are angry at injustice, if you are scared, if you are consumed with dread,
surrounded by death and its power. Or if you're just tired, listen to these old words. O come, thou rod of Jesse, free thine own from Satan's tyranny. From depth of hell thy people save, and give them victory over the grave. O come, thou dayspring, come and cheer our spirits by thine advent here. Disperse the gloomy clouds of night, and death's dark shadows put to flight. Rejoice, rejoice, Emmanuel shall come to thee, O Israel. Hope. All is not lost. Hope is a bridge. Hope is a spark. Hope is an anchor. Hope is a lifeline. And so we come to the third question: what needs to be done? I think I recall correctly that Corrymeela founder Ray Davey used to direct people to go and see what needs to be done. Can I just confirm that with colleagues? Is that true, Yvonne? I see you there. Go and see what needs to be done. There is, I would propose to you, a pragmatic calculation to hope. A pragmatic calculation to hope. The linguist Noam Chomsky addressed an online event around the time of COP26 in Glasgow a few weeks ago, where he was asked the question on everyone's mind. He responded, and I quote, "With respect to hope, we have two choices. We can give up hope and ensure the worst will happen, as it will, or we can grasp the options that exist and maybe make a better world." End of quote. In another example, Greta Thunberg showed the same pragmatism when she was asked if all was lost. And she said, if it's not 1.5 degrees, then 1.6, 1.7. It's not all or nothing. In other words, back in the fight. A desire for hope is not enough. I would propose that there has to be a decision. It takes courage and perhaps even a hint of defiance to choose. It doesn't always happen, but undeniably it can happen, and it does happen. I've been reading this other book here called Threads of Life by Claire Hunter, The World Through the Eye of a Needle. She tells stories of people who found creative expressions of their identity through needlework, even in the most inhospitable places, as prisoners of war or in concentration camps. Stitching in concentration camps or prison, she writes, is a form of self-expression. It requires resolve. It requires courage. The textiles that remains, she writes, are triumphs of improvised tools, scavenged materials, achingly slow progress. Yet, overcoming obstacles, being resourceful and creative, she writes, was life-affirming. And strangely, it seems a pattern emerges where resolve and courage and the desire for hope become sources of hope in themselves. To be for these things in the face of overwhelming odds requires a decision, sometimes a defiant one, sometimes in the teeth of the evidence. Colin McCann, who is one of the most celebrated artists of Aotearoa, New Zealand, captured this sense in one of his most famous paintings. I don't know if you can see it behind me on top of the bookshelf there. I don't know if you can make out the words. He painted this in the mid-1970s. It says, "I am scared. I stand up." Hope is a decision. I would propose to you that hope is a decision, but near the end of my project, I've also come to feel that hope is somehow also an identity. An identity. If trauma requires reframing of identity, there is a decision to make about how we will do that. And I think back to the wisdom that was shared in Corrymeela, and still is, I know, about what identity means, you know, in the sense of choosing the stories we tell and choosing the stories that shape us. And I think that this is relevant as a wisdom for understanding what hope is as well. Choosing the stories we tell, choosing the stories that will shape us. Hope, I would propose, is that kind of identity. So I'm going to choose this story. I'm going to try to be shaped by it. I'm going to choose life and hope in a God of life. A God who was born among us and shared our life until he was killed. A God who overcame the power of death to share our life again and to show us a new way of living together that starts here and now. This is my decision. To find my identity in the resurrection story. Already happened, not yet fulfilled. Hope. All is not lost. Hope is a spark. Hope is an anchor. Hope is a lifeline. Hope is a decision. Hope is an identity. So that's the story so far of this Hope project. And all of that helps me face what is happening in the world. It helps me go through the middle of despair and be pulled back into this world that God loves so much. Which brings me to my final proposal that the final proposal that I would make about hope. Hope, I would propose to you, speaks to make a new world possible. These words are paraphrased from Julia Esquivel, the Guatemalan poet and liberation theologian. The concept of a speech act is probably familiar to some people in Corrymeela too. David Stevens borrowed the term from linguistics and philosophy of language to talk about speech acts, particularly when he was sort of amplifying what the statement of commitment meant. That is, he talked about words that also, at the same time as speaking them, might affect change. So the word blessing is one. It's a speech act. It's about speaking a new reality into being and also doing that reality at the same time. acts that also speak and create space for a new world to be possible. To paint Black Lives Matter in front of the White House in 2020 in letters taller than people was a speech act. It was a creative act of defiance, creating a new space. The other week, I heard another example of a speech act from a young activist at COP26. When she was asked what gave her hope, German activist Luisa Neubauer said this, and I quote, "The Climate Justice Summit is organized by local citizens, and we see these massive protests. We had 2 last week, and you would look around and would see Indigenous folks leading it. You would hear the chants from Latinas. You would hear the African voices being so powerful and strong. You would see signs in every single language. And on the stages, you would see a majority of voices of Indigenous people, young folks, of women, of people really from the most marginalized places on earth, speaking truth to power. You would hear the most incredible voices of people who are usually not listened to, who don't have a platform. And because of that, we built those platforms as citizens, as movements. And we make space for people because there is surely enough space. We need to create that. Hope. All is not lost. Hope is a bridge. Hope is a spark. Hope is an anchor. Hope is a lifeline. Hope is a decision. Hope is an identity. Hope speaks to make a new world possible. In drawing to a close, I want to go back to Twitter. The other day as I scrolled, I ran across a word I had never seen before, Respare. I discovered, clicking the link, that Respare as a word has just a single citation in the Oxford English Dictionary, which calls it obsolete and rare. The word appears to have been coined by a guy called Andrew of Wintoun, who was a Scottish poet and chronicler who lived between 1350 and 1423. And it's coined from Latin roots, meaning again and hope, or perhaps fresh hope or recovery from despair. Respare. So then, as one does, I clicked the next link, and the tweet eventually directed me to this wonderful poem by Craig Van Rooyen. And in this poem, he laments words that are lost and trying to reclaim a new reality by keeping them. And so I'll close by quoting the end of his wonderful poem, Respare. It's been left to me to save everything by remembering. Before the cock crowed, Peter thrice denied Christ, and 20 words marched off into the dark, never to be uttered again. Fortunately, that night, we retained dumbass and forgiven. 2 words it would be hard to live without these days. And if I could, I'd turn myself inside out to resurrect Respare, that forgotten Emmaus Road word for the return of hope after a long period of desolation. Shall we just keep silence for a few minutes, and then we'll pause and take a little break. We shall we regroup? And perhaps we might just acknowledge, Alex, have you put a resource in the chat line if people would like to, for themselves or for colleagues or friends, sort of mental health support?
Yeah, I put up two. One was Action Mental Health, and the other is Inspire Wellbeing. Those are both Northern Ireland based, and there may be some resources that others from the community can put up for other places, either in the Republic or in Britain or further afield if those folks are coming from there. But yeah, glad to have those. I've also just now put into the chat, Rebecca, the handout that you'll be leading us through, and that is a resource that we have put up onto the Corrymeela website. It is just a kind of a reflection tool for this next part that you'll be leading us through. So thank you so much already, Rebecca, for this. It's just an absolute gift. So thank you.
My pleasure. I think it's obvious that I needed to do this myself, and it's been a real privilege to be able to share it with others. And I look forward to continuing conversations about how hope projects kind of evolve. I know that Derek and colleagues have been working on another hope project, and I just think there can't be too many hope projects in these days. May I just open up a time of reflection together and sharing by just making a couple of points with respect to process. I think we are enough people that it makes sense. If you wish, you can raise your hand physically, but that may not get through the ether. So do raise your hand in the, in the menu, if you like. And I'm just trying to remember on this how people do that. Alex, can you just talk to people about how to raise their hand on this format? Because I know there's different ones in different formats.
I think what you'll find on your Zoom screen is there should be a participants window. And then if you might have the option of raise hand at the bottom. So if you do that, we'll be able to see your name come up, and we'll call on you if you have a particular question. The other thing to do actually is just to put your question or your comment into the chat, and we will make sure that everybody, I'll read those out if that becomes the easiest thing to do, Rebecca.
That's great. And then also just a note that we are being recorded. And so please do use discretion about what you share, not only on your own behalf, but absolutely do consider privacy issues in sharing anything that might relate to other people, and do maintain confidential and privacy issues in terms of not identifying anybody else in terms of anything you choose to share. So you might anonymize a contribution or make it so that people cannot be identified. It's really important to respect other people's privacy, particularly when things are being recorded. That having been said, I hope that people will be stimulated to consider a whole range of questions in terms of your own journeys and your own hope projects. So perhaps Alex, you could share the handout. Do you want?
Sure.
Yeah. So I believe there's a link to the Corrymeela website where this is on the website as well. But we just start by thinking of a number of different images for hope, and I wonder if people might consider a little bit about what hope is for you, whether any of these images are helpful, or whether you might actually have another image. Actually, as I'm saying that out loud, I realize that perhaps I don't want to start exactly there yet. I want to just take a couple steps backwards, and I want to just have a space for any comments or responses or sharing just generally about what what we've been reflecting on together tonight. So just sort of general responses first, and then we can kind of go a bit more specific. That's it. And I'm not worried about silence. If people are working on things quietly, that's fine too. So let's just start with any kind of general responses.
People are thinking about whether or not they want to raise their hand or not, or put something into the chat. I know that there is a question, Rebecca, about that poem, which was so powerful, about Respare. And we're just wondering about just looking that up for ourselves, the name of the poet, and is it Respare, R-E-S-P-E-R-E? Is it Respare as in repair? And I think it's you said it was Latin of spare, hope, and respare. Yes.
Yes. So I put the reference to the poem at the bottom of the handout there, and it's R-E-S-P-A-I-R, and the author is Craig Van Rooyen, R-O-O-Y-E-N. But you'll see that on the bottom of the handout when we get there as well.
And I know somebody was saying there may be a blank page when they opened it up, so I'm hoping that the link to the Corrymeela.org and then Nourishing Hope, Nourishing Defiance PDF should be a link that you can all access. So if that's not working, please let us know. So are there any questions or just feedback? I personally, Rebecca, I mean, I just found that incredibly moving. And for you to be able to be that pioneer that's gone through that Hope Project and really to give as much thought as you have to the work is I think a lot of us are realizing it's just the sort of gift that we needed, the tonic that we needed at this time. So if it's nothing more than just echoing my thanks, I know a lot of people are grateful for what you have offered us this evening.
Thank you.
And Breege Cullen is coming to us from Edinburgh. So Breege, would you like to unmute yourself and make a comment or a question?
I just think it's been really interesting timing, and see others in the chat saying too, you know, we really needed this. And I think that lockdown has been a time where lots of us have experienced our feelings, our emotions being much, much closer to the surface. And that's a good thing in one way, and it's a really hard thing in other ways. But one of the things that I've learned in this period has been that I need to talk about how I'm feeling. And I think that's a lot of us have learned. I think we kind of feel a bit freer now to talk. And I think that can only be a good thing, because too often our feelings get quelled down or squashed down with everything else that's happening. So I think the more we can be in tune with ourselves, the better, but that's hard. And it comes at a cost. So I think your reflection has been really helpful, Becky. Thank you.
Thanks, Breege. Thank you.
I think Sarah has a question. Sarah Williamson, who is one of the more enthusiastic. I think she had more exclamation points in her thank you than usual. So Sarah, do you have a question that you want to ask?
Yeah.
And do you want to unmute yourself?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep. Becky, that was brilliant. I'd love to bring you into the NHS in Northern Ireland and pay for everyone to hear. Let everyone hear you talking. I suppose I'm curious about how to apply some of what you've talked about systemically or to organizations, because I feel like people are about, and I've had a couple of conversations about this today, people are nearly like 19 steps before even getting to the point of hope, because so many people like individually are kind of undone at this stage, and then what that does to organizations is just chaos and snarking and people missing each other. So I guess I'm curious to hear what your thought would be around organizational hope.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And your BBC thoughts for the day are reaching me all the way in New Zealand, Sarah. So back at you. Thanks for that. I think the first answer really goes back to the basics of this psychological first aid material, and that I think is very helpful in terms of acknowledging a sort of sense of being unmoored by things, in terms of working with some really basic concepts of getting back to anchoring in a sense of safety, a sense of calm, a sense of connectedness, a sense of agency, and then a sense of hope. You know, there's a lot in those 4 phases before you get to hope, you know, that you're acknowledging by saying that people are 19 steps behind. And I think the beauty of that response, and it needs to be, it can be done by ordinary people, like first aid. It can be done by ordinary people, but like first aid, it can be done well or badly, you know, and so, you know, it does need some care and attention to helping people be equipped to facilitate that kind of process, just like first aid does. You know, but I think that if you're talking about 19 steps behind, then I would look for the organizational, institutional approaches that have been used by that psychological first aid sort of material. And then I think, you know, when you're in relationship with people on one-on-one, then you have dialogue about things. And that's where the other sorts of approaches may or may not be appropriate, useful. Because as we know from our experience in Corrymeela and in other work that we do, you know, all kinds of communication and change requires relationship with people, you know, and thank you very much. I have changed my mind, said no one ever on Facebook to a stranger. You know, it's, you know, change requires us to be in relationship with each other. But I would start with the wisdom of that psychological first aid material. The psychological first aid has been used quite a lot in schools, for example, where a traumatic event has happened, and other places like that. So I expect there probably are parallels that would be, you know, kind of available for NHS type environments, Sarah.
Yeah. Thanks, Sarah, and thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, just that the point, the fact that you've just brought it to our attention that we are all going through this trauma is something that strangely we're all thinking about it. It's coming up, but we haven't had the spaces like this to actually kind of address it. And you were talking about sort of that psychological first aid and how it's been used in schools and certain places. And David Pattinson is bringing up a question. He says, you know, that he saw a leaflet that the leader of a very good Palestinian charity in Gaza said, quote, "We here do not have the luxury of despair." And that, David is saying, has really challenged him. And he's asking whether or not you have any thoughts of that, particularly from your work in this Hope Project. And David, we'll let Rebecca speak, but if I've done that wrong and you want to clarify anything or add to it, please step in and speak, because it's a lovely question, good thought-provoking question. Rebecca?
Yes, thank you for that. There's 2 sides to that. Let me have a think. I think that I have heard that statement from other places too, David, and you know that people who are in unimaginably difficult situations say we don't have the luxury of despair. That is definitely a theme that emerges from some just incredible people who frame their challenge in that way. I also have heard the other side, looking at situations from a place of privilege where it seems like you're telling people that they need to decide something when they don't have any choice. You know, Linda Agnew asked a fantastic question about that in the cell group the other day when we were talking about some of these issues. And, you know, sort of, how can you say people have choice when there's so many circumstances in which they evidently do not seem to have the choice? And I think both of those are challenges. And I suppose it takes me back to many, many years ago when somebody that I had worked with in Haiti sort of succumbed to mental ill health as a result of a lot of very terrible, catastrophic setbacks to the political situation in Haiti. And she didn't survive. And so I'm conscious that there can be a glibness in assuming that everyone makes the same choices and that everyone survives, or everyone even has the same range of choices. And so that said, there does seem to be some power in sensitively, appropriately reflecting on how any of us in any circumstances can try to identify and reclaim the agency we have. That seems to be a kind of really essential ingredient that is very, very important to sort of getting on a road all around the world in very desperate circumstances, about reclaiming the agency we have. And there is a pattern that emerges of decisions that are made with enormous courage and great defiance that seem to be really crucial to this process of hope.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, David. I see a question from John Hunter, and I'll have him on mute. But Rebecca, can you just so we can all write them down for one last time, the steps of the psychological first aid? So there's safety, agency.
So I've got my little booklet of psychological first aid from New Zealand Red Cross here. Let me just read you little bits of it to give you a sense of it. Yeah. So number one, so there's 5 elements. Number one, promote safety. And so that includes help people meet basic needs for food, water, shelter, financial and material assistance. Okay, there's a number of bullet points under each one, but just to give you a sense of what it means. Promote safety. Number 2, promote calm. Stabilize people who are overwhelmed or disoriented. Provide an environment as far as practical, removed from stressful situations, exposures to sights, sounds, and smells of the events. Promote calm. Listen to people who wish to share their stories and emotions without forcing them to talk. So all of that comes under promoting calm. Number 3, promote connectedness. And that is about helping people contact friends and loved ones. Helping establish contact with social supports. And so forth, respecting cultural norms regarding gender, age, family structures, religion, and so forth. Okay, so that's promote connectedness, number 3. Number 4 is what I call promote agency, but what they call, the technical thing that they call it is promote self and group efficacy. And that is engage people in meeting their own needs, assist with decision-making, help people prioritize and solve their own problems. Promote the importance of self-care and so forth. So that's number 4, agency or self and group efficacy. And then number 5, promote hope. And then this is without providing unrealistic reassurance about unknown aspects of the disaster, such as missing relatives and so forth. You can still convey expectancy that people will recover. Be there, show that you care and that you're willing to help, and reassure people that their feelings are normal.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you. Now, John, you had a question for Rebecca.
Alex, thank you. And many thanks to Becky for the analysis. I found it very interesting. I was given for my birthday a few months ago a book by Gordon Brown, which I tackled with some misgivings. But the book, and I have it in front of me, 7 Ways to Change the World. And it includes how to fix the most pressing problems we face. And what I found interesting about Becky's presentation is that while Gordon Brown is hopeful that we will be able to fix these problems, it is an organizational solution based on logic, rationality, and a new world order. Every chapter, though, I've read, I can't help but feel at the end that it is so distant from the individual and the individual motivations of the world in which we live, and which in many instances are characterized by selfishness, that it needs something to transcend that organizational model. And Becky's concept of hope, I found very helpful in seeking to transcend this model, because it reflects a deeper level of faith and emotion and goes beyond the logic and the rationality. So I enjoyed, Becky, your presentation. And I think at times all we can do is focus on the individual level, what we can do in terms of hope. And the guidance you've given us provides us with a mechanism to think through how we might do that. So it's not a question so much, Becky, as a comment on your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. Really appreciate it. And I think you're right, though. I think it's trying to figure out how to remain constructive in the try to get ourselves individually to zero, as it were, in terms of what might be our vocation. And I guess that was another sort of quite traditional thing I fell back on when I was thinking about traditional anchoring practices, was that I realized that the sense of vocation is really important to me as part of this building of hope, because it means that there's something that's mine to do, that's nobody else's to do, and something that I'm called to do, that is my little corner on an enormous, bigger, way bigger than me problem, issue, set of problems. And that sense of being thrown back into the sense of vocation, what is the thing that I'm called to do, was another sort of traditional thing that I found anchoring for me in kind of considering hope. That being said, one of the things that I find hopeful to watch is the ways that people in the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement and other places are constantly, relentlessly trying to find windows when the doors close, and not giving up. And, if the door is closed, is there a window? If the window's closed, is there a way under the wall? If there's not a way under the wall, is there a way around the wall? And so I watch with great admiration my colleagues in international fora continually trying to think about ways to, with climate change, with conflict, with COVID, to adapt, to mitigate, to respond in new and creative ways. And that process in itself also gives me hope at the big level, that there are people who are that creative and that relentless.
Rebecca, I'm wondering, I don't see any other questions coming through or hands up. I just think maybe we could introduce the handout that you have shared, that you're giving to us. I'll share it again. And just with this emphasis that the Hope Project is something that each of us can take on now as we go forward. So I'm going to share our screen again, but if you want to walk us through that,
Sure.
Rebecca, in your own time.
Sure. Thank you, Alex. So I've tried to just summarize the headings here in terms of some of the images, and then after that to do a reprise of the 3 questions. And I would invite everyone to consider those 3 questions for yourselves. What are you saying? What are you learning? What needs to be done? And in particular, what might be your hope project and where you might begin? So in looking at that, perhaps we can leave a few minutes of quiet and then see whether anybody would like to share in terms of your hope project or any stories of hope. Again, considering, appropriateness and so forth, any stories that you have to share of hope. Is there anyone who would like to share about an image of hope that they find helpful, either something that is on this page or something that is helpful to you?
Rebecca, can I introduce you to one of our incoming provisional member, Alison Matthew, who has her hand up. So Alison.
Hi. Rebecca, thank you so much for your talk. That was incredibly helpful. And I particularly found a lot of resonance with hope as a decision, because there's something incredibly powerful about that daily action of getting up and choosing hope rather than choosing something else. And I've been thinking a lot about how we choose to love as well, and how we have to exercise it in order for it to become stronger within us. So I think for me, that really resonated with me tonight, that the little spark, the image of the spark, I think for me was the most powerful, but just that thing about it being a decision and choosing to have an identity that is focused on hope. So thank you for sharing that. It's incredibly helpful.
Thanks so much, Alison.
Yes, thank you, Alison.
Anybody else like to share an image that you find helpful, either one of these or one that you've found in your own life?
A couple of folks in the chat have been mentioning sort of images from nature. So Yvonne Naylor says hope is a seed. Eleanor Duff saying that the day is lengthening, the coming of snowdrops. I think I saw that Heather Godfrey or David Godfrey had a hand up. I don't know if they want to speak still or if that was a mistaken hand up. And Helen Stacy has faith is the bird that feels the light and sings while the dawn is still dark. Lovely. Thank you very much, Helen. Very welcome. David or Heather?
Yes, it's me, Alex. Thank you very much. Really appreciated your talk, Becky. And there are a number of things. I put a wee thing in about the hope being a decision, but there's so much else, like the image of the spark and the rope. Those two, I wish I'd had those in times when I needed it in pastoral situations, because you don't want a long treatise. You want something that is, you can begin to look for those little sparks and things, but also the importance of distinguishing between hope and optimism, because it seems everyone's looking for signs of optimism. What can you be optimistic about? Whereas that seems to me a world away from what we're talking about hope, and hope as a part of faith, hope and love. These are foundational things that you rest on, as well as grow out in their power. That's me just thinking.
Thank you, David. That's all really helpful. Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you, David. Maeve and or Trevor McGowan has said hope is a newborn baby, a la Johnny Mathis, and I'm sure that Trevor is getting misty just holding her hands, so it's nice to hear that. And then Jacinth, one of our great singers, is saying that hope is a song for the singer and the hearer. So it's lovely, Jacinth. It's lovely to have you with us.
Yes.
Great. Well, I wonder if there's any final comments that anybody wishes to make about any of these questions on the screen, and in particular, I hope that you will accept the challenge / invitation to pursue your own hope projects, because I don't think there can be too many of them. Derek, I have been working my way through your Hope project and I really love it. So I'm looking forward to sitting down with that over the holidays even more. I know that there's other people who are doing other things in this group, but may I just close with that invitation and that challenge to you all to pursue your own hope projects. And perhaps by way of closing, I can just read the headings again, and then the final part to that poem, Respare, and then we will draw to a close, perhaps. So shall we be quiet together? Hope. All is not lost. Hope is a bridge. Hope is a spark. Hope is an anchor. Hope is a lifeline. Hope is a decision. Hope is an identity. Hope speaks to make a new world possible. What might be your hope project? Where might you begin? How does it affect you to have hope? Have you stories of hope? From Respare. It's been left to me to save everything by remembering. Before the cock crowed, Peter thrice denied Christ, and 20 words marched off into the dark, never to be uttered again. Fortunately, that night we retained dumbass and forgiven. 2 words it would be hard to live without these days. And if I could, I would turn myself inside out to resurrect Respare. That forgotten Emmaus word road, and if I could, I'd turn myself inside out to resurrect Respare. That forgotten Emmaus road word for the return of hope after a long period of desolation. Thanks very much, everyone. And I hope you have a good Advent and a wonderful Christmas when you get there. Until we meet again.
Oh, thank you, Rebecca. One more time, we'll put the link into the chat if you want to grab it. And but Rebecca, I can only just tell you that you have meant so much to us this evening, and you have been a spark of hope for us in this Advent season, and given us so much of what we need. So thank you so much. And thank you to everyone. You're always welcome to these Corrymeela events. And if you'd like to learn anything more about Corrymeela, please just contact me. We would love to hear more from you. You're very welcome. An expectant Advent and a happy Christmas to you all. Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you, Becky. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you.
Thank you for
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Happy Christmas.
Malakana ditch.
Thank you. Bye.
Trevor.